Greetings, traveller. Here in the silence of this library, I uncover the most fascinating stories that have long been forgotten. Stay a while and listen, and I shall take you on a journey that has endured for centuries. Stories from Sanctuary. Fulcrum's Duty. Chapter 1. Docks of a Dying Empire. By the time the caravan saw the sea, Kehjistan had turned the sky into brass. The dunes rolled to the horizon like an old empire's ribs, and the docks clung to the coastline where the jungle had lost its argument with drought. Warehouses rose from pilings, hammered into the bones of sunken quarters, and between them, the market braided itself from rope, incense, and hunger. The air tasted of salt and coins handled by too many hands. Lanterns were already waking along the piers, as if the sun had forgotten them. The city did not greet travellers so much as price them. 4 came over the last ridge with the wind in their clothes and rode in their eyes. They wore their work the way other men wore names. One had a sword whose plainness was its honour. One had a brass sunplate and a mace scuffed by idols and bone. One moved like shadow when it needs to be seen. One leaned on a staff banded with sigils a windswept scholar would call practical, not proud. They handed over charters with the unspoken truth that iron is a language docs understand. The gate sergeant looked at their faces and at the year and decided to let duty be the easier choice tonight. Vanished, he said before they asked, as if the word belonged between tolls of the harbour bell. Vanished. He spat into the water as if there were a god in it that kept score. Men without mourners, most would say. Dock wolves who taxed the wrong purse. A boss who sold safety and delivered a sermon instead. A man who found the triune again and shaved his teeth for the smiling mask. 1 a month. Sometimes 2. The river doesn't bring them back. It brings questions. The 4 rented space in a caravanserai built from the hulls of ships that had sworn to retire and been pressed back into service as walls. Nets hung like tapestries. The fish inside were carved bone-painted, a tired red. The proprietor slid bowls and news in the same practiced motion. If you came for iron, you'll find it. If you came to stop what's been taking men, you'll find that too. But only one of those pays you with clapping. She tapped her forearm, where saints and debts were tattooed in lines and whorls. The missing were not saints. A pause. But a ledger can balance wrong and still call itself right. They listened. The docs teach that listening is cheaper than bleeding. Old men with hands like driftwood talked about Act 3 as if it were always happening. The jungle's old breath still leaking from the old city's cracked tiles. Traders swore Kurast was a shadow across the water. Sailors swore the docks were its new face stitched from rope and stubbornness. The 4 learned the rhythm. Disappearances near the dark of the moon or the day after, as if a tide unbraided itself and took a man along for practice. Some said it was a cult culling its strays. Others, a gang cleaning its accounts. The word monster was used only as punctuation, the way men mention rain in a desert. They split to make the hours wider. The knight and the priest took the pier wards where watchfires made honest men of shadows. They found a woman who sold bread out of a crate with a crack down its middle. She said a certain foreman had stopped coming for his cut, and then a certain crew stopped working nights, and then the men who had always laughed too loud learned church voices. She did not mourn the foreman. She mourned the pattern. It makes you count yourself, she said, and tucked a loaf under the priest's arm without naming a price. The hunter and the scholar worked the alleys where brine collected in quiet puddles. A rope walk's owner had seen figures on the nights the wind changed mood. Not cloaks, not armor, just the absence of hurry. Quick work, no shouting, no spilled crates, no turned heads. When asked for the where, he pointed inland, not out to sea. Bad things here come from the city, not the water, he said, and went back to measuring rope with a length of bone. The iron wolves kept their barracks like a clenched fist. A lieutenant with a broken ear drew a calendar on a slate and started marking X's, 5 in the last half year, with the chalk hovering over a 6th square. Close to 30 days, he said. Closer if you count tides, like sailors do. He listed victims with a veteran's equal opportunity disdain. Skimmers, shakedown artists, a triunist keeping 2 names and 2 books, a night clerk who had secrets he tried to spend on daylight. Everyone calls it justice until they need mercy, he said. Then they call it murder. A healer whose stall smelled of brackish mint and ground glass listened to the scholar's questions and the priest's silence. He said this was a hunger that knew its numbers. He said some hands cut because they like cutting, and some because the world won't stop bleeding without a seam. If you ask me what kind of man does these things, he said, I will tell you the kind who believes he isn't doing them to people, but to a pattern. The scholar's staff throbbed once, or the wind pushed the stall. Either way, the air remembered old study. The priest prayed where men fought, at the edge of the docks where the wood felt thin and the water felt patient. The prayer was short and unfancy, the kind Zakharum had learned after its banners burned down to chords. She asked for eyes that see and a hand that does not shake when mercy looks like discipline and discipline looks like pride. The waves answered in pieces. The sun set like a coin pushed over a table's edge by a tired hand. They reconvened under the ship ribs of the caravanserai and turned a scarred table into a map. Chalk drew streets that wanted to be rivers and a shoreline that wanted to be a jaw. The scholar walked through the dates and tides with the calm of someone who knows that math is not a substitute for prayer, but sometimes answers a different question better. Next pull is tomorrow night, she said, or its echo, if the pattern keeps its stutter. The hunter set his finger inland, to where the city turned from piers to ruins. The taking moves towards stone, he said. Kurast was 2 ghosts, the jungle-buried city of the old wars and the present dock thing made of drift and stubbornness. Between them lay a girdle of ruins that had learned to keep their heads down, half-drowned ziggurats, temple stumps, reed-choked culverts, tunnels that coughed up air that had been breathing itself for years. Men called one wreck Lamesson's library when they wanted to be poetic about books they'd never read. They called a broken spire holy when they wanted to be forgiven for selling its stones. They called the reeds a marsh when the water was a rumour and the mud remembered better days. Past midnight, the 4 walked those thresholds like physicians diagnosing a fevered limb. The night counted places a body could be moved without cries travelling. The priest tested the wood for where a prayer had been rubbed in so often it left a shine, then found an alley that tasted thin, as if the air had held its breath too long. The hunter marked routes where a man could cross 3 blocks without touching open light. The scholar found, in the soot on a culvert mouth, the faint print of a balanced scale traced and wiped away, a child's doodle to any other eye. She did not name it. She did not need to. Symbols are louder to those taught to hear. They heard stories, and stories as warnings to those who believed stories. A net mender claimed a pale monk bought stale bread and fed the birds. A boatman swore a man with a surgeon's hands paid for passage upriver and never turned back. A boy said he'd seen a skull drawn in salt on a step and then smudged with a heel. Children make skulls, the proprietor said when told. Children learn from men. The scholar asked where. The boy pointed toward reeds. The wind came through the door and did not cool the room. The priest drew a circle on the table and placed the X's around its rim. She did not connect them to a star. That would have been argument, not evidence. Still, the circle pulled. If there is a ritual, she said, it wants regularity and quiet. The hunter nodded toward the triangle of places where quiet pooled. The library wreck, the broken spire turned poorhouse and oath house, the reeds and the old culverts that fed them. He wants the city to be a throat, the hunter said, and the proprietor made a sign without religion. Dawn arrived raw and early. Heat came on like a man putting a palm on a shoulder. The four split again, this time to be nearer to where the ledger's next line might be written. The knight and priest walked the poorhouse spire with the kind of attention that makes men confess small sins just to lighten silence. The hunter and scholar traced alleys that cradled reeds in their cracks and listened for the sound of rope against oar. They left messages with the iron wolves that smelled like respect, not orders. They bought bread with real coin. They made themselves part of the dock's arithmetic. The day lengthened. The docks inhaled and exhaled, and the city behind them held its breath. Children played at throwing bonefish at a chalk line and calling the numbers that came up. A Zakarum acolyte hung a sun plate on a nail and told the plate the story of how the sun does not need to be told to rise. A vendor painted a charm onto a crate with old blood and new hope. Somewhere, someone closed a door and made two locks click like teeth. Near evening, the healer in the brackish stall found them again and said in a tone that refused to be dramatic, "A body without a body," and showed them a pan he used to measure powders. Upon its face was the faintest scrim of ash that did not want to be ash, residue that suggested essence burned neat without flame. "I am a practical man," he said, "but practical men keep an extra drawer for the things that do not fit." He let them scrape the pan. The scholar kept the dust as if it might speak later in a different language. The priest tried not to be grateful for any evidence that didn't involve a mother's wail. That night, the dock bells were quiet and the dogs barked only once, and not from courage. The four did not sleep. They tuned their bodies the way men tune instruments. Oil on leather, chord checked for fray, prayer whispered to keep the hand honest. They agreed on signals. They agreed on where to drag a wounded friend. They agreed not to say the word monster unless the air demanded a name. Then they kept walking, because walking felt like choosing. On the last hour before moonrise, they found the first sign that was more than rumour. A ledger clerk, the kind of man who knew the price of a rope by its shadow, lay in his office with the window propped and the lamp, dead. He was not dead. He was thinner, as if a breath had been taken from under his ribs and not returned. He could not explain the missing hour. He can point to the page he had been writing. A list of ships delinquent. on fees, including one that did not exist anywhere except in men's mouths who wanted to hide their hands. The priest tasted iron in the air. The scholar ground the lamp ash between finger and thumb and watched it cling in a way soot does not. The hunter traced footprints to a window and found the lack of them as telling as the presence. The knight watched the door and put his hand on its frame and felt it tremble once as if something heavy had leaned against it recently and then not. "We're late," he said, and did not mean for the night. When the moon came up, it did so guttering behind a low rag of cloud. The tide changed its mind quietly. Somewhere past the docks, the reeds made a sound like a whisper passing through teeth. The city did not look different. It felt balanced on a count. The four turned their map to face the marsh triangle and counted with it. Then they drew breath, and another, and the priest felt the held breath feeling again, not as chill, but as subtraction. She knew the sensation from tombs, the place after prayer, before the echo returns. "Tomorrow's dark," the hunter said. He prefers it. We walk today until the day is done with us, and then we sit where the quiet pools. "Where?" the knight asked, though he already knew. "3 doors," the scholar said. "We do not pick one yet. We learn which door is being watched by something that believes in math. And if there is no something," the priest said, "then we will know that too," the scholar said, and lifted the little vial of ash and watched how it flowed when turned, as if it remembered a shape. She did not name the shape. She put the vial away. She did not want the knight to think it had taught her a word she wasn't ready to say. They left the caravanserai and stepped into an evening the colour of old copper. The docks breathed out. The land held in. Somewhere, a child counted the paces between lampposts for a game no one had invented for him. Somewhere else, a woman hung a charm and told it to mean what she needed. The four walked toward the triangle of quiet, the way men walk toward a storm they intend to measure before it learns their names. They did not see the man who watched them pass because there was no man to see, only the feeling of having been counted and set aside for later. Chapter 2: Patterns and Tides. Morning came with a knife's edge and a merchant's grin. The docks shook themselves awake, ropes slapping pilings, gulls arguing over scales, hawkers measuring voices against the wind. The city beyond the piers watched without blinking, a dry throat remembering water. Kehjistan had learned to make industry out of wounds. Everything here had a second use, even dread. The four kept their map on the table of the caravanserai, like a vow they were unwilling to fold. Chalk dust ghosting their fingers. Eyes not quite meeting the door, as if the day might listen better, if not challenged to do so. Patterns are the truest currency. The scholar said so with the practiced modesty of someone who mistrusts her own certainty. She walked them through the ledger of weeks and tides and the painful regularity of men vanishing near the dark of the moon or its echo, as if the city were inhaling and then forgetting to exhale. Zakarum's priest did not argue with math. She prayed with it. She added a note in the margin of her heart about mercy for the man who might be next. The hunter let the chalk settle into 3 clean triangles, routes from pier to ruin that avoid light, like a thief avoids his own reflection. The knight tested the weight of his sword and the distance between alleys. They were building a net with numbers for knots. They went to the places where memory and rumour overlap. The iron wolves opened their slate again, lines already smudged by the first counting. The lieutenant with the broken ear pointed. 5 clean marks, aligned with lunar stinginess and sailor superstition, and a 6th day whose chalk waited like a held breath. The wrong men are afraid, which means the right ones should be too, he said, not unkindly. You want eyes in the underlanes. We can loan you boys, who've learned to hear a footfall slip. The knight shook his head. Too many feet spook a pattern. They would go thin and quiet. Wolves prefer packs. Hunters sometimes do not. From there to the peer registers, crabbed hands writing names for coin and permission to be someone official for 1 hour per day. The clerk's ledger had a page of ships that did not exist except in mouths and bribes. One name showed often, then stopped, and in its place another misspelling took over, like a stain someone had tried to wash and only made larger. The clerk, who had learned to survive by letting his face be a door without hinges, said only, "Some cargoes prefer to be sums, not specifics." The scholar underlined the dates anyway, each underline a stitch through a wound that did not want closing. They traced the edges of the city's 2 lives. Old Kurast and the surviving docks tied together by commerce and superstition. Men still told each other at dusk that the jungle had once marched to the primeval's tune, that the temple city had been a single body with 1,000 throats whispering to a single heart under Travancore. That was history's comfort and history's threat. If the land could be made to breathe wrong once, it could do so again. The present-day dock quarter remembered that story in a practical way. It built shrines to keep the water calm and told children which alleys the night had eaten before. They spread themselves along the triangle of quiet, the ziggurat bones men called a library when they needed an excuse to respect ruins. The broken spire turned poorhouse, whose stones remembered sermons and heat. The reed-choked culverts where old water had once coughed, now a throat too dry to sing aloud. Daylight made all 3 look patient. Twilight would make them attentive. The hunter scouted lines no cart would bother with. Roof to roof, rope to ledge, shadow to shadow. He found 3 places where a man who measured his life by footfalls could walk and never touch the street. He marked them in his mind, not on the map. A drawn line can betray its draw. The priest stood in the poorhouse spire and let its prayer-scratched stones press their memory into her skin. Some of Zacharum's shame was buried here, and some of its stubbornness, both useful, both heavy. A woman with river-glass eyes sold bread at the door and said that lately, men who should have swaggered had started counting steps instead. "There's a quiet that isn't peace," she said. "You can hear it the way you hear a storm learn your name." The priest bought 2 loaves and a story about a man who had stopped coming for his cut. Neither purchase made the world more just, but both made it more precise. The scholar entered the library wreck with the hunter's shadow alongside. The air under shattered vaults had a coolness that was less a kindness than a long memory behaving itself. The scholar tasted soot that did not want to be called soot, and found the faintest finger-traced circle on a culvert mouth, a balanced symbol smudged away in a hurry or a habit. She said nothing. The hunter found wax beadings where seals had been made and unmade, and remade, with care, bordering on devotion. He pocketed one, turned it with his thumb, and felt it give not at all, the way math does when confronted by pleading. By mid-afternoon, their net began to tug back. A witness at the rope walk, one who measured strands for a living, and thus trusted length more than faces, had seen 3 nights ago a figure that was more absence than cloak. Not the theatrics of a cut purse, not the plodding arrogance of a boss with men behind him. He walked like he was on time, and the world should apologize if it was not, the rope maker said, ticking off the memory with bone measure. He didn't touch the puddle. He didn't touch the wall. He never forced a path. The path made room. The hunter and the knight exchanged the look men use when metaphor starts sounding like evidence. Ormus, the healer with brine on his breath and old study in his eyes, listened without asking for names. A hunger that measures itself, he said, repeating yesterday's diagnosis as if to see if it still fit this morning's wound. He presented a scale pan with a whisper of ash that clung to the metal more than cinders should. I do not pretend to understand how essence takes a shape and then refuses to leave it entirely, he said, amiably lying to avoid a lecture. The scholar took the ash with a politeness learned in cloisters built of debt. The priest did not cross herself. She had learned in Kehjistan that gestures could be catalogued and used against the soul. The knight worked the watch routes. He stood where men had stood long enough to develop habits and tried to see their habits as a thief would. A pocket of blind ground where 2 torches never quite overlapped. A corner where sound bled into water and made lies out of footsteps. A door that always swelled in the evening, like a throat deciding whether or not to swallow. He filed away the more dangerous patterns to warn guards later. He filed away the most dangerous to use himself tonight. The city tilted toward evening. Lamps stuttered to life along the piers. The dogs barked twice, then thought better of a 3rd time. The 4 reconvened at the ribs of ships and ran their fingers again around the circle they had drawn, as if the wood itself might tell them they had gotten it right. The scholar placed the wax bead on the map without comment. The hunter added a pebble where the rope maker had described absence walking. The priest laid down the loaves she had purchased as if feeding the table might make it kinder. The knight moved their markers a half thumb toward the reeds. We sit and wait, he said. We watch the breath. Waiting separates zeal from skill. They waited in places chosen for seeing without being counted. The hunter above a lantern, whose wick he knew would gutter at the right moment. The knight in a doorway that the watch believed was his. The scholar behind a lattice of fishbone where incense smoke would excuse her own. The priest near a shrine where a sunplate hung so that any witness would think she was part of the furniture of faith. They kept each other in the corner of their eyes as best as alleys allow. They made a pact with discipline. They tried not to imagine the face of the man they were trying to save, because the doc taught that imagining faces makes you slow. Midnight crossed the city without event, which is an event. The tide turned with a sound, like a tired god changing sides in his sleep. Far inland, a smear of reeds moved against no wind. The hunter saw it first, because he had chosen to be where that kind of movement learned first to confess. He gave the signal that meant now and not yet. The scholar felt it too, as the air tightened, not cold, not warm, but precise, like a hand closing on a throat not to kill, but to measure the length of breath. The priest's fingers found the haft of her mace without her eyes leaving the shrine. The knight stepped into the alley's mouth and let it accept him like a bargain. Absence is its own shape. Someone crossed the far end of the street and the space around them briefly behaved. A man folded into the gap between two talks where dock quarrels ebbed. He did not wear a cloak that wanted to be seen. He did not advertise himself with silence. He simply passed, and the dogs, who'd been asleep at their posts of honor, raised heads just enough to declare they had no opinion. The figure laid a hand, gentle, practiced, on a shoulder belonging to a longshoreman with a ledger clerk's conscience. The longshoreman blinked as if trying to dislodge grit, and then stood, the way men stand when they have decided to follow a dream into the street. He walked. The hand did not stay on him. Ownership was not the point. The hunter slid along his roofline. The scholar moved like a prayer that does not need witnesses. The knight let the figure gain a street's length to avoid spooking them into speed. The priest whispered the shortest litany for protection she knew, frictionless syllables that would not trip a ritual if a ritual were in the air. The four became the shadow behind a shadow, and the city was generous with cover. They moved from fishbone lattice to cart shadow to broken wall. The figure never looked back. The longshoreman never hesitated. This was not a kidnapping. This was a collection. The path angled from dock, through market, past the poorhouse spire, where the sunplate watched without judging, toward reeds that crowded old culvert mouths. Twice the figure paused, not to listen, but to let the world's schedule catch up. Twice, the longshoreman swayed and steadied, as if a voice inside him were reminding him how feet work. The second pause was long enough for the hunter to count the beats of his own heart, and not like the numbers. The scholar mouthed shapes to herself, not spells, but the names of materials: wax, salt, ash, as if assembling a small kit of courage. The reeds received them. The marsh hadn't held water in months, and yet it exhaled like something that remembered being wet. The culvert's stone mouths were dark from habit rather than drink. The figure stepped into their perimeter, and the air forgot sounds it had been carrying. The longshoreman followed with the obedience of a man who believes his errand is his own. The four did not step into the ring. They circled it. A hunter's patience, a knight's restraint, a scholar's catalogue, a priest's refusal to scandalize the shrine she had left behind with panic. It is possible to hear a ritual without knowing the words. The priest felt it first, a lilt in breath, a pressure like hands setting something on a balanced plate, somewhere not here. The scholar's staff quivered at its core as if a scale had been set on a table in a room she could not see. The hunter's skin prickled along the forearms and then smoothed, like wind crossing barley. The knight tasted metal. The longshoreman stopped moving. The figure raised one hand in a gesture that meant continue and enough at the same time. Then both vanished into the black of a culvert mouth, not big enough to swallow a cart, yet somehow adequate for swallowing men. The four followed. To a point. There is a difference between bravery and falling for theatre. They stopped at the threshold. The scholar touched the stone with 2 fingers and flinched, not from heat or cold, but from the sensation of having been counted, weighed, and filed. The hunter knelt and saw the faintest line of salt just inside, broken in one place by a heel. The priest whispered a word that meant forgive us our ignorance, and forgive us our certainty in the same breath. The knight measured the angle of the opening and where a man would hold a scything weapon if he meant to discourage guests. He did not draw. He did not need to be told the shape of an ambush is flatter than this. Sound moved strangely, a scrape like a bowl being set down far away, a sigh like rope stretching and then not. Then the longshoreman's voice, calm and unafraid, saying something that could have been an oath or the repetition of one. The priest reached forward and felt the draft of a chamber expanding beyond the first bend. The scholar smelled beeswax and faint bone dust. She did not say who she was thinking of. Names are a kind of door. The hunter signaled, left breach, right guard, scholar center, priest guarding souls back. The knight nodded. Go on his count. They measured 3 breaths together as if they were one. The culvert mouth seemed to lean toward them, interested. The reeds behind them hissed, or perhaps it was only the city breathing in and holding. The map on the caravanserai table was very far away and still present in the set of their shoulders. Now, the knight said, and the 4 slid into the throat of the culvert. Not running, not creeping, just moving with the kind of care that makes death work harder to earn its meal. The salt underfoot squeaked once. The sound ran ahead of them like a sent messenger. They smelled the candle before they saw its light. A pallid flame protected by a glass hood, burning without the comfort of smoke. The air around it was absolutely still, as if locked away by the flame itself. They reached the mouth of a chamber and stopped as one body. The room inside had been cut clean from old stone, not hacked, not broken. On its far side, a doorway gaped like a closed eye, unwilling to open further until given a reason. On the near side, a table stood, and on the table, a scale, an actual scale. Brass gone dark, pans empty, beams straight. Beside it, a box with wax seal cooling, a loop of string pressed carefully into the bead. The longshoreman stood to the right of the table, not bound, not drugged, simply present, eyes steady as if he were reciting a lesson to a kind teacher. The figure who had led him here was nowhere in sight. Don't move, the knight breathed, and no one did. The priest saw script on the wall, shallow as a breath. A line of text that might have been a warning or a comfort, too worn to read without stepping further in. The scholar felt the echo of a second chamber beyond, where air was being measured to the pace of a pulse that was not hers. The hunter watched the longshoreman's hands and saw fingers working at a rhythm, as if counting. The knight counted too, because he could not help it. All the numbers were wrong in the same careful way. A sound from the farther doorway, not feet. The setting down of something that resented being made physical. Then a voice, not theatrical, not cruel, merely precise, as men speak when they are very tired of explaining the same mercy. On time, it said, and the scale's beam trembled as if it were listening. Chapter 3. Weighing the breath. The chamber had the quiet of a page turning before ink touches it. Stone walls smoothed by time, a ceiling that returned sound only after thinking about it. A brass scale on a narrow table, its beams straight, its pans empty, the whole object patient as a judge. The longshoreman stood beside it with the poise of a man who had decided to be unafraid, even of what he could not name. The wax on the sealed box had cooled with a neatness that suggested a hand that disliked mess. From the far doorway came the sound again. Something set down softly and resenting being made matter. Then the figure stepped out, robes the colour of old bone, a sash without ornament, a staff with a ferrule that had scuffed stone by intent rather than accident. His face was the kind of careful that comes with discipline rather than deceit. His eyes had the depth of a man who has taught too many apprentices to expect cleverness to save them. No theatrics, no cruelty. The four had expected cruelty. They adjusted. "On time," he said, and the scales beam trembled as if in sympathy. "That makes the world easier." He touched a finger to the pan on the right, not enough to tilt it, only enough to acknowledge it existed. "This is the place where the sum goes," he added. "Not to the longshoreman, not to the four, perhaps to the room, perhaps to the habit of saying things aloud, so that doubt has to find a voice to answer." The knight's blade remained sheathed because the chamber's geometry demanded it. A drawn sword becomes a statement becomes a trigger. "Step away from him," he said. The words travelled the room and came back unchanged. The priest stood half a step behind, her mace low, her other hand open, a palm that could bless or push or close into a fist as needed. "No one's breath belongs on your scale," she said, and the sunplate at her breast felt very heavy and very honest in that moment. The hunter didn't speak. He counted exits and angles, the height a leap would need, the way a ward would likely sit in this stone. His hands knew where his knives were without looking. He noted the longshoreman's pupils, not pinpricked, not blown. This was not a drug. This was a scent bent into a shape by something older than fear. The scholar held her staff like a measure rather than a weapon. She had seen ritual rooms before, cantors' halls, summoners' pits, prayer cells polished by knees, and this was like those and unlike them. The scale was not a symbol, it was a tool. The script, shallowly incised along the far wall, almost worn away, was not a benediction or a threat, but an instruction. 2 short phrases about sequence and seal, about measure before motion. Like marginalia, left by a precise hand for an apprentice who kept wanting to skip steps. She did not step closer to read them. Restraint is a kind of reading. "I will not step away," the figure said, and neither belligerence nor apology wrote the words. "But I will stand where you can see my hands." He shifted his staff to his left, palm open, fingers light, and set the ferrule down with the care of a man who does not want to jar a delicate instrument. The longshoreman's mouth twitched, as if he wanted to smile at a private joke. "You found me early," the figure added. "That's rare. Rarer still, 4 hearts and none looking for coin." His gaze moved over them like a scalpel. Knight, priest, hunter, scholar. He did not look at their weapons. He looked at their posture. "Say what this place is," the knight said. He did not ask who the man was. Names invite games. "A room to keep a promise," the figure said. "A small room for a small promise." A glance at the brass. "Small is relative. You would say large because you measure by lives." He indicated the far doorway with that open hand. "Beyond is a thing that grows when weighted properly and fractures when not. When you feed it with what it asks, it is a stopper in a bottle. When you starve it, it becomes a mouth." Who taught you to speak like a ledger? The priest asked. She did not keep the bite out of it. Mercy can be sharp. An accountant, he said, and a dragon. The last word he delivered without drama, as if dragons were a unit of measure rather than a species. The world's breath has to go somewhere. The balance is not a metaphor to those of us who have to keep its books. It tips. We tip it back. By taking men, the knight said. By returning a weight that has been misplaced, the figure said. When the city tolerates a pattern of injury, the scale doesn't note the speeches saying it shouldn't. It notes the injury. Injuries, like debts, draw interest. Someone pays. I prefer that it be a ledger that has already stolen value from the world, rather than one that is still learning to be poor. He inclined his head toward the longshoreman. This man has offered to pay part of the interest today. Voluntarily. The longshoreman spoke for the first time, voice steady. My brothers on the crew knew what I did, he said. I don't want the ones who didn't to pay for the ones who did. I can carry one, he added, as if describing a sack of flour. He asked if I would carry one. He looked at the priest. It mattered that he asked. Choice under pressure is not choice, the knight said. The figure accepted the correction and did not agree. Consent is a spectrum. So is necessity. If I make a habit of taking the unwilling, the balance notes that habit too. Pain has shape. I avoid shapes that echo themselves too loudly. He gestured to the box with cool and wax. This seal closes a cycle. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But tonight, closing it buys this city an interval measured in months, not minutes. If we miss the mark, the interval changes. He held the scholar's eye on the word changes. What happens if you stop? The priest said. Something patient stops pretending to be patient, he said. Something that was fed by what it hates finds a way to feed on what it can reach. Something that was content to be a stopper remembers it is also a corkscrew. There is a door that is a throat. There is a throat that is a door. The wrong diet, and it learns. It is a mouth. He nodded to the doorway. Do you need to see it to believe that it will learn? The scholar didn't look past him. She kept her eyes on his hands. Who sent you? She asked instead. And why alone? Sent is a strong word for a vow that never goes away, he said. As to alone is slower and safer. Zeal makes teams clumsy. One body is easier to account for. One conscience is easier to audit too. He smiled, not unkindly, at his own gallows humour. Dragons do not write orders. They are orders. The scholar began, and didn't finish, because the knight's look said, don't make this the kind of conversation that invites gods to listen. The priest took a breath she wished didn't feel like asking permission. You believe you're right, she said. I believe you're not allowed to be. There's law and there's mercy, and there's the ugly work you make us all do when you say the numbers leave no choice. If you're convinced this device has to be fed, choose someone who deserves it, who has chosen nothing. Don't make martyrs out of men trying to become better by carrying other men's debts. Deserving, he said, is a word that writes its own lies. He indicated the longshoreman, who stood as men stand when waiting to hear which bone will be set and which broken. He has taken wages he should not have. He has carried contraband he should not have. He now wants to put weight where the world needs it to go. He is not more innocent than the ones I prefer. He is merely more visible. He considered the priest. But because I am not cruel for sport, I will offer a correction. He placed his palm flat on the edge of the scale table. One of you can pay the weight. The hunter's jaw worked, a muscle in his cheek flicking once. The knight's gaze didn't move. The scholar swallowed because her throat had become a rusted hinge. The priest felt something very old in her training flex and take a step forward that her feet did not. No, the knight said, and his voice did not rise. We don't play that game. It is not a game, the figure said, equally quiet. It is arithmetic. The city has been tolerating subtraction. Someone adds back. The balance does not care whether the coin is dirty before it becomes gold. It cares about equal and not equal. If one of you carries the weight, then men like this one, a glance at the longshoreman, are spared twice. Once from their own habit, once from the need to pretend their habit is charity. If you want to stop the pattern, stop it by paying it, instead of preaching at it. Describe paying, the scholar said, not to agree, but because knowledge is sometimes leverage. So we know what we are refusing. The figure inclined his head, pleased by precision. Essence, he said, not life entire, the breath that sits under breath, what some call anima, what others less poetically call vitality, enough to nourish a seal, enough to blunt the mouth behind the door. It hurts. It does not kill if the donor is strong. His eyes moved from the knight to the priest to the hunter and came to rest on the scholar, measuring, recalculating. It will scar, he said. Scars are honest receipts. And if we refuse, the priest said, then the city will pay with whatever currency it has most of, he said. Fear at first, then flesh. Those who thought they were outside the ledger will discover that the ledger does not recognize outside. It recognizes only entries and balances. You will stop me. The seal will starve. The door will learn a new grammar. He looked toward the doorway again, as if to make sure it wasn't already eavesdropping. It will learn open. The longshoreman's hands, which had been steady, began to shake, not from fear of death, but from recognition of the weight of choosing. If one of you would let me carry for him, he said, voice careful, I could still do the carrying. He looked at the priest. Or we could carry together. There was a rough hope in the offer that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with men wanting to make a hard thing a little less hard by the simple math of shared load. No, the knight said again, and the word cost him. He was a man whose courage ran toward lifting, not away. We don't legitimize this. He looked at the figure in bone robes. There's law for a reason. There's judgment that isn't yours or mine. You short-circuit it and call it mercy. Law is a map of preference, the figure said. Balance is a survey of terrain. His tone held no sneer, only exhaustion's clarity. You can't legislate the tide. You can only note when it turns. He touched the scale's beam with a fingertip. It trembled and settled. I have the seal. I have the window. I have a man who will carry if asked and if not forbidden. I am asking, will any of you carry more than he does, so that those like him will carry less later? The scholar's heart said, yes, the way a hand reaches toward a candle from cold, before the mind reminds it how skin works. The priest's oath said no, and meant it. The hunter's training said yes to the pain, and no to the permission it would grant. The knight's entire life said no to any math that walked around consent and called it choir music. "We came to stop you," the knight said, the simplest truth available, and the figure accepted it as a ledger would accept an entry, without surprise, without delight. "Then we will do our work quickly," the figure said. "You will wound me. I will likely not wound you badly enough to stop you. The seal will starve. The door will open. And then your map will be the horizon of a smaller world." He lifted the box a fraction, as if to ask the room's permission to continue, then set it down again. "If you live long enough," he said, almost kindly, "you will understand the mercy you killed." The priest stepped forward, despite the knight's hand trying to become a wall. "Stop using mercy as a blade," she said. "If the world is unbalanced, do the work that doesn't involve cutting throats in back rooms and calling it balance. Bring men to courts. Drag them. Teach. Don't hide in culverts like shame. Courts count what can be counted in words," he said. "This counts what refuses to be words." He tapped the scale. "I don't hide out of shame. I hide to keep the work from being confused with fashion. If I make a spectacle, the city will learn the wrong lesson and love it too much." His eyes flicked to the longshoreman. "He deserves a quiet decision." "We all do." The scholar asked the question that had been standing behind all the others like a tired sentinel. "How do you know this works?" she said. "Not in doctrine. In practice." He considered her, respect and weariness exchanging places in his gaze. "Because when it is done, the air here stops tasting like iron for a while," he said. "Because the watchers who are not corrupt stop counting losses. Because the river's story's slow. Because the nightmares the city pretends our weather lose their teeth." He looked at the doorway again with the attention of a man checking a watch. "Because if it doesn't get done, it speaks. And you don't want to hear it learn the shape of your name." He turned to the longshoreman. "Do you still consent?" he asked, and the man nodded like someone stepping into cold water on purpose. The figure touched the sealed box and then the scale, and the room seemed to take a breath that belonged to all of them and to none of them. The scholar felt the draft of an idea trying to become a wind. The priest felt her sunplate grow heavier as if pulled by something beneath, not above. The hunter's fingers tightened because the body knows when a threshold is close. The knight shifted his stance because battle begins in small adjustments long before the obvious movements arrive. "Last offer," the figure said, and it was not bargaining so much as procedure. "One of you carries, or you stop me and carry later in a larger way that you won't call carrying. Choose." The priest shook her head. The hunter's chin dipped once in what could have been an apology. The scholar closed her eyes for the length of a heartbeat and found the courage to open them again. The knight spoke for all of them because someone had to. "We refuse." The scales beam trembled as if a tiny draft had crossed it. The figure exhaled in a way that made no sound. "Then we will proceed to the part where we fail each other," he said, and the smallest smile moved through his mouth and did not reconcile anything. He reached for the box. The knight moved his foot a fraction to set weight. The hunter's hand knew where the first throw would land. The scholar measured words that would disrupt a seal without breaking a soul. The priest lifted the mace, because mercy without force is a wish. "Forgive me," the figure said, to the scale, to the seal, to the doorway, to the dragon whose name the scholar did not say aloud, perhaps to the four, perhaps to the city. "Forgive me for not convincing you faster." He broke the wax. The room's air jumped as if startled. The candle flame hiccuped but did not go out. The scale did not tilt yet. The doorway learned their names enough to be interested. "Stop," the knight said, and the figure did not. "Stop," the priest said, and prayer hardened into command. The hunter's knife left his hand. The scholar's staff found the floor with a sound like a neat line drawn on parchment. The scale's beam moved. Chapter 4. Ledger, paid in bone. The wax cracked, the scale quivered, the room clenched. Then he moved. No apology, no speech. Bone armor rippled over him like pale plates snapping into place, shoring rib and shoulder where blood had already started, a quiet geometry of protection that made the air wince. His offhand snapped a line across the floor. Pale growth erupted into a circular lattice, bone prison, that rose with a dry chitter, trapping the knight and priest in a ring of ossified bars while leaving the scholar and hunter free. Exactly as if he'd read their spacing and written the battlefield from it. The knight's blade hit the cage with a shock like iron on kiln-fired clay. Chips flew. The ring held. The priest slammed her mace low, breaking a rung at the root. It regrew as if remembering itself. The acolyte's staff scythed, not to strike, but to aim. Bone spear tore from the ground in a razor line, a pale lance that chewed the space between him and the hunter, passing through the first knife thrown in defense, splitting it, and still hammered the wall in a spray of bone shard reflections that ricocheted and cut the hunter's forearm in 3 precise lines. Position mattered. It always does. "Break left," the scholar snapped, already speaking a stagger rhythm that tripped the counting magic in the room for a heartbeat. The hunter rolled, used the ricochet angles to his advantage, and flung a blade into a gap. The spear's shards had left the bone armor seam under the acolyte's arm. It hit. His face did not change. He flicked fingers, a curse without flourish, and the hunter's legs filled with cold silt. Speed sludged, tendons convinced they were rope run through brine. The knight shouldered the cage, buying inches for the priest, letting her mace smash and wedge and pry. Splinters rained. The acolyte, unfazed, raised both hands. Vertiginous ribs erupted from stone to form a new bone cage half a step deeper. Doubling wall for wall, an inner ring that locked around where the knight's momentum had taken him. Bars angling in to make room smaller, to press stance into mistakes. The priest shoved him back before the cage could knit around his sword arm. The ring sealed with a vertebral sound. The scholar set her staff, spoke 2 clipped syllables, and slapped a palm against the scale's beam. The brass sang. The acolyte reacted, not anger, not fear, calibration. He launched another bone spear low, a gliding spine that skimmed the floor and detonated under the scholar's heel into shards, the reflections scything upward. She pivoted, boots grinding salt, shards scoring the staff's wood, one nicking her cheek with a cold line that bled like paper. She tasted iron and kept counting. He threw his hand open. The floor erupted. Not corpses raised, but bone gathered, compressed, unraveled into a swarm of knives that flurried and hovered like calcified wasps. He sent them, not to kill, but to herd, shearing the hunter away from the seal, carving corridors the acolyte wanted them to take. The knight braced a cage bar against his shoulder and pushed until tendons sang. The priest hammered the same point. Aim, shiver, crack, pry. The bar broke. They stepped through into the tighter ring and found themselves pressed chest to chest, with bars growing back like teeth. The priest jammed her mace head sideways to block regrowth. The knight shoved his scabbard into a slot to wedge space for hips. Ow! The knight grunted. You first. The priest bared her teeth. No, then went, because obeying sense is sometimes the only way to make courage useful. The hunter kicked off a wall and used the bounce to put an arrow straight through two of the bone wasps. They exploded into flechettes that stitched the air. He dove under them, came up in a cut pocket of safety, and snapped a cord around the acolyte's ankle, yanking. Bone armor took the fall for him. He hit stone and rolled in one motion, fingers brushing the seal as if to push it away, not to finish it. Don't! The scholar barked, knowing he wouldn't, knowing reflexes are made of habit, not argument. Bone spear again, this one tearing a straight white line toward the knight's head. He parried, but the spear shattered on the blade with that signature shrapnel scatter, shards fanning backward into the priest's shoulder. Her sunplate rang. She stumbled and did not fall. She answered with a sunlit invocation through gritted teeth, short, bright, ugly with purpose, that shoved the nearest cage post an inch as if the concept of it had hiccuped. Again, the knight said, already pushing where her prayer had made the world slippery. The bar cracked. He tore himself out into the open with skin left on it. The room was a storm of pale geometry and red noise. The acolyte planted the ferrule and called a ring of chin-high ribs, bone cage number 3, this time only around the scholar, reading her triage roll correctly. The bars grew inward, like a flower closing. She made a tiny circle with a staff tip inside the ring and spoke a balancing tone that drawled through 2 notes at once. The cage growth slowed, confused. The world, trying both options and finding neither satisfying. It bought a heartbeat. The hunter took it, slid between ribs, and shouldered her out as shards hissed like rain. He never addressed them. No stop, no argument, only one clipped plea, eyes lifted fractionally above them, as if at a ceiling none of them could see. Forgive me, Tragul, forgive me, then to work again. A man with too many columns to reconcile, and not enough night. The night closed, choosing pain. He stepped into a spear's line to get an arm on the staff. The spear punched through meat, shoulder to back, hot, precise, nauseatingly clean. He pinned the staff against the acolyte's hip with his wounded arm, took the scythe of the man's elbow on the jaw, spat blood, and drove his hilt into sternum through bone armor until plates cracked like kiln-failed tile. The acolyte's breath hitched, but his eyes stayed on some internal metronome. The priest came in from the side and smashed the bone armor seam the hunter had opened earlier, caving in a plate, making the next hit count double. The hunter used a shard of broken rib like a hooked knife and ripped at a strap of the sash that held the phylactery weight at the belt. It came free, skittering, coolant blue sigils pulsing. The scholar lunged, snatched it, and slammed it under the scales pan, pinning it where leverage became argument. The beam quivered and steadied a hair towards center. The room took a breath that didn't belong to it. He reacted with the ruthless calm of a surgeon losing time. Bone prison spiked from beneath the scholar's feet, grabbing calves and thighs, ossified rings clamping and lifting her an inch, pinning her for a finishing lance. She flung the staff down, speaking a serial unraveling, 1, then 2, then 3, that turned the first ring to chalk, the second to powder, the third to a grip that didn't know if it had hands. She tore free, bleeding where bone had kissed skin, open. The acolyte lifted his hand for a final spear, a true bone lance, narrow and wicked, hissing as if it knew it had a job only it could do. It sprang. The knight shoved the priest aside and took it, because that is what the body trained to do. The lance went through his side. The room stuttered time for a beat, the sound of a ledger line drawn too hard. The priest of Rathma looked up past them again, to the ceiling only he recognized. Forgive me, Fulcrum. Forgive not to the party, not to law, to the balance he served. Then the hunter's cord cinched. The priest's mace struck true. The scholar's staff snapped the counting rhythm, and the knight's sword finished the math with the simple line that ends a column. He dropped. The bone armor sloughed in flakes. The cages began to slouch and crack, ribs unraveling into dust. The bone swarm collapsed into harmless grit. He did not look at them. His last breath was a measured thing with one purpose. Forgive me. I failed the interval. Then nothing. The room held still, not peaceful, stalled. The scales beam hovered, then listed, a degree, then 2, toward the hungry door. The candle pin-straight flame collapsed and guttered into a bead that glowed without light. The 4 stood over a problem they had solved and a catastrophe they had purchased. They hauled the wounded knight out, the priest's hands red and steady, the hunter binding with strips of his own cloak, the scholar pocketing the phylactery she hated touching. They took the dead man's staff, because leaving it felt like letting a page turn wrong. They did not look back. They did not need to. Some failures follow without being invited. Celebration was crooked and quick. The Iron Wolves marked the ending with clap on back and cups thrust into hands. The proprietor called them the word men want when they've bled for strangers. Someone paid a debt they didn't owe. The longshoreman, alive and bewildered with the relief of the spared pressed coin and gratitude, and was told no, spend it on a door. Laughter learned how to be laughter again. Briefly. The priest smiled because it cost less than explaining the weight in her chest. The knight endured the binding with grace. The hunter let a boy trace the nicks on his bow. The scholar set the phylactery under a stool and put her boot on it, as if her heel could be a law until the room changed its mind. Then the world tilted, cups slid. Dogs remembered how to howl in unison. From the direction of the reeds came a pressure like a hand pressing on the city's sternum. Lamps along the outer pier leaned out and then in, their flames made tall and thin. The harbour bell rang 3 times without wind. Men who have seen sieges put down their cups and looked at their hands as if asking them if they were still good. They went outside as one. Over the marsh, a bruise uncurled, a dark that wasn't cloud, scribbled through with pale lines like bones trying to learn how to be lightning. the sound it made wasn't thunder. It was breath. The first exhale the city had heard from the thing the acolyte had been feeding. The second, the third, each fuller, each less interested in scholarship. There was no running back to fix anything. There was no fix. The scholar knew it in her bones, the way a bridge knows the river's true name. The phylactery under her heel ticked, heatless. The priest put her hand on the knight's shoulder because he would try to stand when the tilt came, and she would help. The hunter gripped the rim of the door and watched the bruise bulge toward the edge of the city. It came on like weather that had learned a grudge. Reeds lay flat. Air cooled with a damp that did not exist anywhere else in Kehjistan. The bruise kissed the first line of shacks, and a seam opened in the air. Thin as a page edge, black as a closed eye. It slid sideways, cutting the row in half without breaking wood. Houses simply weren't there from the seam inward, as if excised from the ledger. The remaining halves settled. People inside screamed, because what else is the body for? The wolves surged, and what training can do they did. Formed lines, ushered, shoved, shouted, numbered orders. The bruise ignored tactics. Knot doors budded and opened like saws. From each, a spill of knot insects poured. Bone-white motes that ate light and then learned that eating heat and skin was easier. Lamps died in waves. Men swung and struck and felt contact and saw only absence chip and refill itself like a ledger correcting an entry. The acolyte had said it would learn grammar. It didn't need to. Appetite writes its own. The city's prayers hit it and fell. The priest spoke the sun's name until her throat hurt, and the only reply was light going thin. The knight stood until standing was only theatre. The hunter loosed into the seam and watched arrows become equations solved into nothing. The scholar said a word meant to persuade and could feel it be refused for the insult of trying. A dock crane groaned and tipped, its chains snapping and lashing. A barge at mooring lifted and set as if something had gotten underneath it and was practicing. The shrine bells hit dissonance and stayed there. The proprietor slammed her door and leaned her back against it and sang a little song meant for children. A boy held a bonefish on a string and let the string go because it felt like treason to keep it. Around them, the city collapsed in neat, polite increments. Lanterns erased, alleys shortened, houses made partial. Between, the knot insects learned haste. Between that, something larger rolled in the bruise, an implied body trying to be born from rules and succeeding because rules love to be obeyed by anything. The four could do nothing that would change the column they had drawn a line through. They stood and they watched and they took the weight because there was nowhere to set it down. The priest's eyes filled and emptied and filled because tears are a kind of penance the face can do without permission. The knight repeated a line from a lore he had believed in and heard it come back wrong from the air. The hunter counted the people he could still move, if moving meant anything. The scholar whispered, "Interval," and hated that she'd learned to love the word too late. It went on. It didn't crescendo. It established. The city became a smaller map. The bruise learned streets. The docks became an anecdote someone would one day tell badly. Above the reeds, the sky decided this was its colour now. He hadn't looked at them when he died. He had looked past them and asked forgiveness of the Fulcrum he served. They understood why now, in the bone-deep way only consequences teach. He had never been their audience. The balance was. They had cut the hand holding the scale and declared justice. The scale had continued falling. The last thing the four did was not brave. It was true. They stood together and did not explain themselves to one another, because explanation is for afterward, and afterward had been cancelled. The city fell apart around them, neatly, inexorably, like a ledger paying itself with what it had, and the bruise above the marsh breathed in and breathed out and kept breathing. The story has come to an end. Our hearth still burns. Stay, warm yourself, and let sleep take you as the world drifts into silence.